Good morning. It's a joy to be with you this morning and this opportunity that we've had to worship our God together. What a beautiful day it is outside. What a wonderful time it is for us to be here together, worshiping God together. And I'm excited to be here. I know you're excited to be here as well. And what a great opportunity we have to open up God's Word and to study from it. I mentioned in a lesson that I did several weeks ago, probably a month ago now, that, this year, one thing that I've done in my own just personal studies was trying to go back and some of those stories that I had convinced myself that I know everything there is to know about this story. I've read it so many times. I've thought about it. I've talked about it. I've had other people's talk about it to me. I've had them in Bible classes, that there are some passages that we are just convinced we know everything that's there, that I've tried to go back. And I've tried to dig a little bit deeper into some of those passages. And it has been a fascinating study for me. And I made mention then, so fascinating that I'm compelled to share some of those things that I've run across. And if you remember, about a month ago, we did a study in Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the story of Noah and the flood. And the tremendous story that unfolds for us there in those passages. Again, a story that we're familiar with. A story that if you were to ask most of us here, hey, is this a story you know about? We'd say, absolutely, I know all about that story. But digging into that passage, there was just so much good stuff that was there. And it was such a fun study for me, and it was enlightening in every way. And so I shared some of those things. Well, this morning I want to do the same. In another passage that I went back and have recently kind of dug into again, and again was fascinated, no longer surprised, because that is the way God's Word is designed. It's designed to be alive. It's designed to give us life. It's designed to change us. It's designed for us to go back and back and back and back to. And it has been a joy to do that. And so this morning I want to share once again some of the things that I have found in my recent studies about a story that a lot of you will be familiar with and may in your seat say, I know everything about that story. Well, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. But it'll be good for us to dig in for a few minutes this morning in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17, and the story that we have of David and Goliath. It's a tremendous story that unfolds for us. We're going to read a good portion of 1 Samuel 17 together this morning. Not the whole thing. We'll jump around a little bit, but we're going to pick out some things. We're going to point out some things that I think are important in the story, things that I had not necessarily thought much about before, and thought about what the story teaches, and maybe even looking at David a little bit differently from this passage. And so I'm excited to dig into this passage. I will, like Stu, a great word. Let's take a journey. What a great word he used this morning. I love going on journeys. Let's take a journey through the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Not the whole Bible. Stu is on a long journey this morning with our songs. We'll be on a much smaller journey just through the book of 1 Samuel and chapter 17 this morning. But before we dig too deep into that chapter, I want us to establish some context about where David is and who David is during this moment. I think sometimes there is a challenge in our mind to understand just what David is all about at this point in his life. Sometimes I think photographs or imagery fools us a little bit into thinking that in 1 Samuel chapter 17, when David was going up against Goliath, that he was like a young child or a boy, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old even. That the idea that he was just a young child almost going up against Goliath. The imagery, when you go and look at the images given, a lot of that will portray that idea. But I want us this morning just to kind of use the context of chapter 16 a little bit and chapter 17 to help us to get a better understanding about who David is right now, what he's all about. and maybe not necessarily his exact age. The only thing that we can tell from that, it seemingly is he is not old enough to fight in the army. That is about the one thing that we do know for sure, because he isn't there with the army. But the idea that he is a young child, I think, is very much debunked in the context of 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17. And so for just a few minutes, before we get into the story of David and Goliath specifically, let's expand our context and understanding about what David is all about. And so we'll start in chapter 16. In chapter 16, we're really introduced to David. The prophet of God goes to the house of Jesse, and he is to anoint the next king. And that story in and of itself, we don't have the time to dig into the entirety of it there in chapter 16. It is in itself an incredible story, and one that it's not a very long chapter, but I would encourage you to read. If you've not read it in a while, read it today. It won't take you very long. Find a couple of minutes this afternoon and read chapter 16. But the house of Jesse is there, and he's got all of these sons. And the prophet of God says, listen, one of your sons is going to be king. And he kind of parades all of his sons one by one in front of the prophet. And each and every time, the prophet is saying, nope, he's not the one. He's not the one. He's not the one, until all of the sons have gone through. And he says, it's none of these. Do you have any more? Do you have any surprise sons? I mean, do you have anybody else? And he's like, I do have one more, but I've not even brought him here. He's out in the fields. And he says, go get him. And he brings David. And David is the one chosen by God. He is anointed to be king over Israel after Saul, the current king. But I want you to understand a couple of interesting things happen at the very end of chapter 16 that I think help us to understand his relationship with Saul at this time. So at the very end of chapter 16, after David has been anointed to be the next king of Israel after Saul, David and Saul have a relationship. They know one another in a very specific kind of way. I'm in chapter 16. Look, beginning in verse 21 down to the end of this chapter. Beginning in verse 21 of chapter 16, it says that David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was. Whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand, and then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. And so this relationship begins, and the phrase armor bearer is used, but it seems at this point David is coming and going from Saul. Saul would feel the need to have David near him to ease his soul, to ease his pain, to play through his music, and then he would send for him. And so it seemed that David would be going back and forth. He didn't remain with Saul continually. He went back and forth dependent upon when he was called upon. How do we know that? Look at verse 15 of chapter 17. Now we're in chapter 17 and verse 15. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And so this was something that David was doing. He was going back and forth when Saul would need him. It seemed, even here where the army was, David had his own tent there. Have you thought much about that before? He's coming back and forth when Saul is calling and needing him. And it seems that David has his own tent there. Chapter 17 again, the very end of this chapter in verse 54, after Goliath has been defeated, the head of Goliath has been taken by David. And it says in verse 54 of chapter 17 that David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So that would make sense. That David is going back and forth when Saul would need him. And it isn't until after this point that David remains with Saul continually. The very next chapter, chapter 18, beginning of verse 1, it says that it was so when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Verse 2, Saul took him that day, that's David, and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. And now this relationship between Saul and David is much more permanent. Where before he was coming and going whenever Saul would need him. And at the end of this story, after Goliath is defeated, David continues and stays permanently with Saul. And so I want to establish some of that context about David, where he is in his life, what he's all about, even his relationship with Saul. And so now chapter 17, this incredible story, we're going to begin by setting the context. We're not going to read all of this, but the context really of this story is given to us in verses 3 through 27. We're going to jump around a touch, but that'll give us an idea. But I want us to do some reading here. 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 3. I want you, as best as you can, to be following along as we read, but at the same time envisioning the scene that is unfolding. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel is very graphic in its language. Very graphic. If you're not very good at painting scenes or painting pictures in your mind, you're not going to have any trouble with that in chapter 17. Because it seems as if every detail is given to us. And so let's follow along. Let's paint the picture in our mind of what's happening. And we're going to start in verse 3 and just go down through verse 11 here to start. It says, chapter 17 and verse 3, the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. And now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. And then he stood, and he cried out to the armies of Israel, and he said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, I want us to think about the scene that's kind of out before us. Again, very visual. I mean, everybody can see it. You have the armies of the Philistines on one mountain ridge, the armies of Israel on another mountain ridge, a valley in between them. And every day, day after day after day after day, this giant of a man would go down into the valley. So big is this guy. We don't get, like we do from Saul. Do you remember how it is that the Bible describes Saul and his size? He was a big man, a head taller than everyone else around him. That's all we get. Now that tells us he was a big guy, but we get a lot more about the bigness of Goliath. Did you like that? I know the high school kids like that. We had a discussion about if bigness was a word or not in our class, and I wrote it on the board. And so once I put it on the board, that's it. I mean, it's a word at that point. But then I think we changed it to largeness, and then we had a little discussion about that, and then finally settled on greatness. So maybe I was backed off of that a little bit. But the Bible gives us very specific details about the size of this guy. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Weighing a coat of mail that weighs 125 pounds. Just what he's wearing weighs 125 pounds. I mean, sometimes we think about the clothes that we're wearing. Listen, if you're like me, I very, very rarely get on a scale. Very rarely get on a scale. But when I do, I'm making sure I've got no shoes on. I'm not in blue jeans. I think they weigh 50 pounds. I mean, that's our, we think, oh, I got to get rid of all these clothes and weigh myself. Maybe that's a pound of clothes we normally wear. Goliath, 125 pounds. He's carrying a spear where the head of that spear weighs 15 pounds. He was a giant of a man. And he presents himself before the army of Israel day after day after day, challenging, send a man to fight me. And the text tells us no one was interested in that. Not even Saul, who we know was a big man himself. Not just were they not interested, they were greatly dismayed and afraid. And now this is the scene that David is going to step into. This is the scene that he will come and face. So I want to back down just a little bit. I want to pick up our story in verse 20. And we'll read down through verse 27. So David arose early in the morning, and he left the sheep with the keeper, and he took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array and army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. And then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. We read those words earlier already. And so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king, will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption in Israel. And David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, well, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. And so the scene that's unfolding each and every day, David is now there. He's bringing some food for his brother, sent there by his father, and he sees what we had just read earlier. The armies gathered together to fight, but Goliath steps out in front and he proposes. If you can defeat me and kill me, we will be your servants. But if I kill whoever you send, you will be our servants. And David hears that. Not just does he hear it, he sees the response of the people around him. The army of Israel, his own brothers, his own king. We learn here that Saul has even gotten to the point in a lot of ways of bribery. He says, if you're going to be the one to go and kill this guy, I will give you incredible riches. I'll give you my daughter as a wife. I'll give you great wealth. I'll even give you tax freedom for your father's house. Incredible, incredible prizes. And this is the scene that David has walked up into. And I'll tell you, as I was reading it a while ago again, I don't know why, but for me, the book of Esther popped into my mind. And the line that Mordecai is giving to Esther as he says, you need to go talk to the king about this. You are the only one in a position seemingly to do something about it. And we have that incredible phrase, you have come for such a time as this. That's what I think about here in 1 Samuel 17. David is on the scene. He sees. He has been there, and God has brought David to this camp for such a time as this, and David was ready to accept the challenge. And so he takes it upon himself to do something about it. And so as this story unfolds, we see God and David coming into play. And in every way, everyone around David is discouraging him. But it is God who provides the encouragement. I want you to look for that. We're going to read 28 through 39, and I want you to look for the ways in which God encourages David when he faces this incredible challenge. We're again chapter 17, now 28 through 39. It says, now Eliab, his oldest brother, that's David's oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, well, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. And when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now remember, Saul and David, they know one another. This is not a stranger situation. They know one another. Verse 33. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it. And I delivered the lamb from its mouth, and when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. And moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. And so David took them off. Now, I want you to think about this section of text that we have, a really interesting section that I don't think we spent a lot of time in because we want to get to David fighting Goliath so quickly. We know why he's there. Let's get to the good parts, we often say. Well, there's a lot of good parts right here in this piece of text. Because I want you to understand what happens the very moment that David is willing to take a step out in faith. Immediate discouragement from the people around him. It's his brother. Immediately. He's stepping out. I think I'll go do that. His older brother, nope, you're just a tiny guy. You're here just for your own selfish pride and just wants to see what's going on. You can't do it. Other people around that are hearing this, the text tells us that they are saying the same. Saul, he gets word of it. He sends for David. And what does he say? This is a bad idea. Nope, you can't do this. Those are the words. You are not able to do this. He is surrounded the very moment he takes a step out, the very second. And don't you think Saul and everyone else, they have been waiting and begging for someone to take a step out, and no one has. Everyone is taking steps backwards, running from fear. David takes a step out, and immediately he hits discouragement. You can't do this. It can't be done. You are a fool. You are mistaken. His older brother does it to him. Saul, he's not much help. He says, you aren't able to do this. And this kind of thing is exactly what happens today. When we do everything we can to try and walk by sight instead of by faith, we calculate then everything by human perspective. Eliab, he's looking at it solely from a human perspective. And he sees David and he sees Goliath and he says, no way can you do this. And Saul, he's looking solely from a human perspective. And he sees David, a young fella, and Goliath, who's been a warrior since he was a young fella. And he says, no way. When we do that and we live that way, we live by a human perspective, it is only filled with worry and fear and anxiety. But like David, if we can put ourselves in a position to walk by faith, now what does that do? We're calculating everything. We're calculating, but now God is added in. And he says, I see Goliath. He's a big guy. He knows what he's doing. He's big and scary. I see him. I'm calculating that in. I see me. I'm a young fella. I'm calculating that in. But now I've got God. And I'm calculating that in. And David says, let's do it. My calculation says this is going to go well for me. Because God has been added in. And he uses the point. Every time God has been added in, it's gone well for me. He's already experienced the power of God. He makes mention of it multiple times. He has killed a lion. He has killed a bear. And he knows that God can deliver to him Goliath. He's calculating God in. And in our life, that has to be what we do. We have to calculate God in every circumstance. And even the circumstances where the world human perspective says, you're in a bad spot, I calculate God in, and suddenly it's not as bad as it was. I want you to hold your finger in 1 Samuel 17. I want to give you another example of this in the life of David. In the book of 1 Samuel, a little bit deeper in 1 Samuel chapter 30. A little bit later on in the life of David, he's now having a very different relationship with Saul. And he's running around. He's having problems. He's fighting with Saul. He's hiding from Saul. He's got another kind of army that's with them. And there's something that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 30 where while they're gone, his people and their women are attacked and taken captive. And the people aren't happy with David because of that. Look at the phrase that's used. I love this. Look at the phrase that's used. I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and in verse 6. It says, then David was greatly distressed. That's why he's come back, and including his own wife. Is gone, has been taken. For the people spoke of stoning him. They were upset. You're in charge, and you let this happen. And because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But look at this phrase. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. What an incredible phrase that is. It was a bad spot for David here in 1 Samuel 30. How did he get through that? Well, he's calculating God in. He strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That's exactly what's happening right here in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And so as he calculates him in, as the story closes, it is not David's great victory, but take notice that it is God's great victory. Let's read finally verses 40 through 49 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. It says, and he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and good-looking. And so the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me. I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And so it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. An incredible, incredible story. But I want to point out just a couple of what I believe are really important pieces here. This story is primarily, I'll say in an unfortunate way, in the world used in a sports setting where someone is very likely to lose against someone who is very likely to win, and the announcers will say, well, we've got a David and Goliath scenario. I hate that. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hear it over and over because I watch a lot of sports, but I hate it. I hate every time that's used. Even us, we will use, and I think rightly so, that there are some applications about overcoming our obstacles. David is there, and he is facing an incredible obstacle, and he's able to overcome that. We'll use phrases like defeating the giants in our own lives, and I'm okay with that application. I believe that there is a piece of that there. But while there are several applications that can be made, I don't want you to miss the main idea of this story. And it is what, when I looked at it earlier, really hit me, maybe for the first time. But the main idea of this story, especially in this section that we just read in verses 40 through 49, that David did what he did simply for the glory of God. That's why he came. That's why he did it. He was defying the Israelites. And not just the Israelites, but God because of that. And David wasn't having it. You will not come out and speak this way against God. And so I will therefore glorify him. And he did so for his glory. He comes to the contest in the name of the Lord. And he wanted Goliath. And he wanted the entirety of the Philistine army and all of the earth to know that the true and the living God was Israel's God. Listen to what's said again in verse 46 at the very end of this. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you and take your head from you. This day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air, the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That all the earth may know. David saw this as a contest between the living God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines. And he says, I'm going to step out there and everyone will know who God is. And I want you to understand that idea is from the very beginning of Scripture to the very end. That we are to live our life with that mantra. Each and everything that we do should be to magnify the Lord. Every place that I go, does this place and what I'm doing here magnify or glorify God? If it doesn't, I need to leave. In every word that I use and everything that I say, do those words magnify and glorify God? If they don't, I need not to say them. We can use that idea in every single thing. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us different, because what we do is to God's glory, not to man's. And so that means I'm going to speak differently because I'm glorifying God in how I speak. I'm going to go different places and do different things because I'm glorifying God in where I go and what I do. I'm going to wear different clothes than what everyone else wears. Why? Because I'm glorifying God with this body, and the world glorifies man. Every single action that we take needs to be in that direction. And here is David. He's saying, I'm not going to take any more this defiance against God's name. His name will be glorified. And I want you to take note throughout Scripture. We're going to read these very quickly here at the very end. But I want you to understand that God wants us. He wants us to magnify His name to all the nations of the earth. And it is everywhere. I'm going to give you a few examples. I'll leave this up for a few minutes if you want to take note. But we will turn to these. Even in God choosing the very people of Israel to be His people. Listen to what's said. Deuteronomy chapter 28 is where I am, beginning in verse 9. This is the establishment of them as a people. Look at what he says. Verse 9 of Deuteronomy 28. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to Himself, just as He's sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in His ways. And look at verse 10. Then all the people of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. Who? All the people of the earth will know who your God is, and they will be afraid of you. Look at the book of Exodus now. Exodus chapter 9. Again, in the midst of a story we're familiar with, the people of Israel are enslaved in Egypt, and God is bringing them out. He's bringing them out. And look at what He says about the judgments that He brings down upon Egypt. I'm in Exodus chapter 9 and verse 16. But indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you. Listen, and that my name may be declared where? In all the earth. What an incredible passage that is. Look at a couple others. Joshua chapter 4 now. In Joshua chapter 4, the very beginning of this book, the people find themselves finally in the promised land. And listen to what's said about the power that God has shown in the crossing of the Jordan River, in which they had just done, and even the crossing of the Red Sea that had happened decades before. Joshua chapter 4, listen to the language that's used, beginning at verse 23. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which He dried up before us until we had crossed over. Why? Verse 24, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. One other passage in the Old Testament, and then we'll get to the New Testament in our life. But look at the book of 1 Kings now, the building of the temple. The building of the temple by Solomon, in which David had kind of begun that process. In 1 Kings chapter 8, beginning in verse 42. 1 Kings chapter 8, beginning in verse 42. For they will hear of your great name, and your strong hand, and your outstretched arm when He comes and prays towards His temple. Here in heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name, who everyone should know who God is. And I'm going to be the one that showcases that. Finally, in the book of Philippians, in Philippians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul, in a very similar kind of way, I think exemplifies for us our take in the way that we should live and operate with this same idea. In Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 19, he says, "For I know that this will turn out for my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Paul says, in whatever circumstance, Christ will be magnified in my body. And when people look at me, God will be glorified. When they see the places I go, God will be glorified. When they hear the words that I use, God will be glorified. When they just look at me, Christ will be magnified. And so when Goliath sees a young man walking out to him with a sling and a staff, he laughed. He chuckled about what was standing in front of him. But David announces that he was coming with real power, the power of the Lord of hosts. Paxton read for us Psalm 18, a psalm written by David in the face of deliverance. The very end of that psalm, in Psalm 18, beginning in verse 31, it says, "For who is God except the Lord, and who is a rock except our God? It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He sets me on my high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze." You see, that understanding from David of who God is what gets him through 1 Samuel chapter 17. And it is that God, the God of David, the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, it is that God whom we serve today, whom we glorify in the life that we live, and the things that we do. We magnify his name to the people around us in all ways. Because when we step out in faith and the world pushes and prods, God is there to hold us up. And as we bring this lesson to a close, and Stuart is going to lead us in a song of invitation, I'll leave you with one thought given to us in the book of 1 John. In 1 John chapter 5, John will talk specifically about the kind of relationship that you can have with God, just like David did. He says in verse 4, 1 John chapter 5, "Whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that he has overcome the world, our faith." Who is he who overcomes the world? But he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. What a powerful, powerful passage that is. And I would encourage you as we think about this story given to us in 1 Samuel 17, a story that a lot of you will be familiar with. You take away today that you are dealing with a man in David whose sole thought was glorifying the name of God to the nations around. And that happened through the slaying of that giant of a man in front of him. We live our life the same way. In all that we do, in all the places we go, in all the things that we say, in everything that we are, I am magnifying and glorifying God to all the people of the earth. What a great, powerful way to go through this life. And as Stuart leads in the song of invitation, it'll give us an opportunity to think about that relationship, where we are with that God. You want him next to you, or do you want him away from you? I want him next to me. And now you've got to answer that question. And maybe you've got more questions about that. what that relationship is. How do you establish that relationship? If you've got questions like that, I'd be happy to sit down with you and talk about those things from God's Word. Or maybe you know in your mind and in your heart that sin is what causes that relationship not to be what it needs to be. Let's do something about that. Let's do something about that today. And maybe we can help you with that in some way. If we can, you let us know as we stand and sing.